Welcome to our campus, Dr. Nancy Ammerman. And I'm especially delighted to welcome her, given the fact that she is coming in from Boston in the wake of a major snowstorm. She really gets kudos for being the world's best sport with all of this in terms of working with changing flight schedules, cancellations, and schedule adjustments. And so we're deeply grateful for her persistence and good grace in still coming to be with us. So welcome. As you know, Dr. Ammerman is professor of sociology of religion at Boston University, and her research has given us a remarkable look at the social and religious contexts and currents that shape the world in which we live. A decade ago, she published an award-winning study of institutional life, congregations and denominations. We both understand something about what those are about. The book was called Pillars of Faith, American Congregations and Their Partners. But her work helped us see some of the characteristics of these institutions and organizations more clearly than we had before. More recently, her work turned to the question before us at this conference. It's called Sacred Stories, Spiritual Tribes, Finding Religion in Everyday Life. I find it fascinating because it takes us down to that level of lived experience, and it opens up fresh perspectives on the faith stories in the ordinary world around us, the ordinary world in which we spend so much of our time and energy. So I'm eager to have her take us further along this journey, and I ask you to join in welcoming Dr. Nancy Ammerman.
Thanks so much, folks. It really is good to be here. Through about 4 different versions of my flight itinerary and finally arriving, and you folks have been so wonderful in being flexible along with me as we've said, oh, Deb and Sally, here's the latest version of what United says about how I'm going to get there. And it's really good to have the opportunity to be in this kind of setting and among people who are concerned about thinking about the life of faith, thinking about the way we gather in our communities of faith and how those communities can be made stronger. What I want to do this morning is talk a little bit about these terms that you all have in the title for this convocation: religious, spiritual, and I'm going to suggest faithful, and suggest a bit about how we may need to make sure we keep religious and spiritual together. That term religious has really gotten quite a bad rap these days. An awful lot of people, often with very good reasons, think they really don't want to be thought of as religious. Certainly, I work on a university campus, and lots of college students come to the notion of, religious is just one of those things that you don't want to be, and you don't want to talk about religion in polite company. But faithful people have also often been leery of the term. We want to be careful about being accused of empty religiosity. We don't want to be merely religious. And people outside the churches are only too willing to look at those of us who claim to be religious and point out our hypocrisy and say, yeah, that doesn't really count for much, right? But lately, that question of whether you're religious or not has seemed to take a new kind of turn. Some of you may have seen a study that was released about 1.5 years ago now by the Pew Forum, which does really good research on religious trends in American life. And one of the things that they've tracked is the rising number of people who, when they're asked in a survey, do you have a religious preference or a religious affiliation, they basically say none of the above. We social scientists have for a long time been talking about those people as the nones. So the title of this report from Pew was The Rise of the Nones. And we love to talk about things like nuns reproducing themselves, and that's, you know. But one of the things that this report showed was that there really has been a pretty dramatic rise in the number of people who are reporting that they have no religious preference. It's now about 1 in 5 adult Americans overall. And what's even more telling is that it rises as you look at age or at birth cohort. That is, the people who are the oldest, who were born early in the 20th century, are the least likely to say that they don't have a religious preference, and those who are the youngest, those born in the 90s, are the most likely. In fact, among young adults, among the so-called millennials, it is about 1 in 3 who say they have no religious preference. But when we are looking at this particular population of people, I think it's important not to make too many assumptions about what it means not to have a religious preference. That 20% of the overall US population that doesn't have a religious preference is a pretty mixed bag. There are some people within that population that are in fact confirmed atheists, who are very sure there is no God, there is no higher power. Any way you want to ask them the question, they are going to say no, no, no. There are other people who are what we might think of as agnostics. That is, they're just really kind of not sure. But there's a large proportion of that 20% is what Pew called the nothing in particulars. That is, they aren't really sure about much of anything. They just kind of don't really like any of the alternatives on offer. In fact, other surveys, including the Pew survey, show that 66% of these people, not surprisingly, say religion's not important to them, but only 28% say they don't believe in God. 59%, not surprisingly, say they don't ever pray, but only 38% say that they're not at all religious. What's this going on here? So, you know, there's a lot, and in fact, this is not entirely a so-called spiritual but not religious crowd, okay? Less than half of them would use that as a way to talk about themselves. It's a really ambiguous category, this none category. And in fact, it's so ambiguous that in other research we find that only about half of them stay nuns from one survey to the next. So the people who did that particular survey talk about the difference between the consistent nuns and the inconsistent nuns. And they talk about this inconsistent category. They dub them the liminal nuns. They're sitting on the edge. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But the stable nuns, the ones who stay from one survey to the next, they're pretty sure they really and really don't have a religious preference, are in fact an interesting category. They are younger. They are less likely, and I think this is really important, they're less likely to say that they actually ever attended religious services when they were growing up. They are more likely to have been raised by parents who were themselves outside any kind of religious affiliation. And remember that bar graph? You know, we're already starting with the baby boomers to have a rising number of people who have no religious preference, so they've had kids who have no religious preference. And increasingly that is the case. And in fact, these are folks who are married to somebody also who has no religious preference. So you get the picture of people who are, this particular category of people, who are increasingly sort of surrounded by a world in which not having a religious preference is normal. So two different groups of people in this sort of marginal, outside our religious communities population. One is a group of people who really and truly aren't spiritual, aren't religious, aren't seeking, they really have no strong religious roots. And here's another interesting fact about them. One of the reasons they have such an aversion to religious communities is more about the politics of it than the spirituality of it. They've grown up in a world in which one of the things it means to be religious is to be affiliated with a very conservative political stance. Whether that's true or not sort of doesn't matter, but the picture they have in their heads when you say religious is Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. And that, we know from the research on this group of people, is one of the factors that has produced their aversion to being part of a religious community. But there is this other group, this other disconnected group, the liminal people, the kind of moving in and out people who are on the margins of religious communities, on the margins, and they're there for lots of different reasons, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in a few minutes about what may have pushed many of these folks out toward the margins. But it's important for us to recognize at this point that these are not necessarily people who have left and pursued a vital, thriving spiritual journey. There may be a few of those folks out there. But both my own research and the research of a lot of other people leads me to say to you today that these are very likely people who are both not religious and not spiritual. When they tell you they're spiritual but not religious, cast a little doubt on that. Don't necessarily argue with them, but don't necessarily believe them either. One of the things that my research has convinced me of is that being spiritual, leading a vital spiritual life, requires what I call in the title of the book a spiritual tribe. It requires a community. Whether it is the usual organized traditional religious communities that we know, or whether it's some other kind of community, we really don't do spirituality very well on our own. And that means that we need to be tending to the possibility of spiritual life among those disconnected folks, as well as to the spiritual lives of the people who are inside our religious communities. So I'm going to begin this morning just briefly with reminding you of a few of the things that make forming a spiritual community difficult but important. First, the difficult part. There are, in fact, a lot of fraying connections in our world, connections that we've come to depend on in the past that really aren't there so thoroughly anymore. One of those connections is, of course, what we think of when we think about our lives together in a geography, in a place, and connected also to the job market and to a career over a lifetime. One of the things that we know is that the reality of geographic mobility has been with us for a while, especially since World War II. There's been a kind of steady stream of people moving from one place to another. And when you look at 85% of households staying stable from one year to the next, you think, well, that's a lot of stability, until you add up the, 15% every year, and that starts to add up pretty fast. It also starts to add up pretty fast when you think about young adults. Because young adults, the under 35 folks, in a 5-year period, half of them will have moved far enough away across county lines that they're probably not going to be in your congregation anymore if they were to begin with. Okay? Under 35 folks, half of them are going to move in a 5-year period. And one of the reasons they're going to do that is because of the kind of fluidity of the job market that they're a part of. If you think about, how long have people been in their jobs? And 2 years is a pretty short period, right, to be in your job? Well, among the people in their 20s, 2/3 of them have been in their jobs for 2 years or less. And it doesn't get a whole lot better in their 30s. 42% of people in their 30s have been in their job 2 years or less. That's a lot of change in people's lives. They're geographically moving, they're moving in terms of their jobs. Those two obviously connected to each other, and also connected to a more elusive kind of thing, becoming a real adult. We've kind of got in our heads this picture of what a real adult looks like. A real adult is somebody who works full-time at a kind of steady job, can be financially independent, doesn't live in mom and dad's basement, is married, maybe is starting to have children. Those are the things that we kind of still have in our heads. And if you think about the reality of that movement that's going on among 20 and 30-somethings today, you see the degree to which it takes longer to get to that point where they and we look at them and say, they've really made it to adulthood. So challenge number 2 is that community doesn't depend on geography. So we've got them moving around, right? And they're still able to form communities. How do they do that? Well, at least in part, through social media. Our community doesn't depend on geography. And I'll give you a couple minutes to read the slide and chuckle. About Facebook and Twitter, we are in fact more connected than we have ever been, but it's not connection that depends on geography. We're connected across literally the entire globe. Challenge number 3 to forming an actual in-place community of people who are going to support each other on a faith journey is that those households that we were talking about a minute ago don't necessarily fit the church mold. Most of us, I dare say, and in fact much of the population, still thinks of church as something you do when you're married and have kids. In fact, there's a funny little statistic. This is a graph of the what households look like these days. And the part that you want to really look at is the dark blue pie, slice of the pie, the married with kids slice. 20%. In the 1950s, that slice of the pie was 50%. 50% of households consisted of a married heterosexual couple with their children under 18. Today, 20% of households are that. And here's the funny statistic. Among that 20%, congregations are still getting roughly the same proportion that they were getting in the 1950s. But we're not getting them from all those other slices of the pie. The single living alone, even the empty nesters, they're off to Florida. You know, the fastest growing household type in the country is people over 85. How many people are trying to build congregations on people over 85? Yeah, okay, I saw a hand, and congratulations to you. Because those people over 85 are probably going to live at least another 10 years, and if you keep bringing them in, you can build a congregation, by golly. No, this is to say our picture of what constitutes the right kind of household to go after is really at odds with the actual demography in our communities. So all of that put together, all that fluidity, the changing kind of households, means that connections really are harder to make in terms of forming a local community. But what I also want to suggest to you is how important those local face-to-face communities still are. They're important because, among other things, they are critical partners in serving the needs in our communities. We know that our safety net in the US is pretty frayed, and we need local congregations as places to actually organize the kinds of services that people need to survive in our communities. We also know that congregations, in spite of the fact that we're connected by Facebook and Twitter, congregations are still really important places for people to gather together, to belong, to have a sense of, I've got a place in an otherwise hostile world. This is especially true for minority communities. One of the things that remains so important for African American people, for immigrants as they are coming into our communities, is that there's a place where they can actually gather with people like themselves, where they can celebrate holidays, speak their own language, worship in ways that feel familiar. Those are really important pieces of what congregations still do. We also know that congregations are really important to the overall social fabric. Now here, you know, I'm going to do a little sort of social science, political science speak on you here. That one of the things that holds a society together is having places where people can voluntarily gather together and where they can build up a sense of trust, where they can learn that you can trust people beyond your own blood kin, where we learn how to communicate, where we learn how to work together. And when we have those places that we can do those things, that sort of spills over into the larger society. Another way of talking about this is talking about building up civic skills. So social capital, civic skills, these are things that political scientists look for, and they say, you know, when you've got a society that brings people together into communities where they practice this stuff, where they learn how to express themselves in public, where they learn how to organize meetings, where they learn how to deliberate and make decisions, that stuff spills over into the larger society. You need that stuff to happen. So religious participants, as it turns out, all these political scientists and social scientists going out, you know, looking at what happens when you have communities and you have people participating in them, one of the things they discover is that, you know, we just kind of make good citizens, good neighbors. And I could show you all sorts of data about how people who participate in religious communities are more likely to volunteer, they're more likely to give money to charity, they're more likely to help people in need, on and on and on. So we know that this is something that's happening, and if you ask yourself, well, so how does that happen? Is it because the preacher got up and preached a sermon about how you should go out and do that? Well, maybe at least in part. At least in part it's because people are in a community where they're getting taught this is the way you should live. But they're also looking around and seeing the models from people around them of being engaged in the community. They learn it both by word and deed. They're also learning it because they're learning about opportunities to be involved in service in their community. Congregations are key network points where people make connections and talk to each other, and where people learn about how to get involved. And it's also where they get a chance to actually practice at doing these things. And as a result of practicing, get a sense of, well, I can do that. I have the power to make a difference. One of the things that was really interesting as we were interviewing people in the Spiritual Narratives Project was to listen to them talk about the things that they see in their world every day that they're concerned about, that make them think, somebody should do something about that, that should get fixed about the world. And there was a really interesting sort of pattern in the way people told those stories about what needed to happen. The people who were not involved in religious communities, were not active participants, were more likely to point toward some sort of structural change that needed to happen. Now, many of us who are leaders in religious communities would very much like our participants to be able to think like that. To think, it's not just about handing out a sandwich, it's about fixing the system. But those people who weren't involved in religious communities were also very likely to say things like, somebody should do something about that. The people who were involved in religious communities were more likely to tell a specific story about themselves and their community actually doing something. There was a clear sense of engagement and empowerment that was present in those stories that actually wasn't present in the stories that we heard from people outside religious communities. Now, that's all good social science, political science speak about why congregations are important. But that's not why you came here. We do know that our communities need our congregations, and they need them to thrive. But so does our faith. So does our own spiritual life. We need our congregations to thrive because we need them as places that nurture our way of being in the world. Now, here I am going to talk about some additional research, but also my own research. Just quickly look at Pew's findings when they asked people who were not affiliated why they decided to change, why they decided to actually become affiliated. And the top two reasons are very much connected to some sense of spirituality. They're not just sort of practical, if you will, social, communal kinds of reasons. They are about relationship to God and about participating in worship, about having a sense of finding a place in which one's spiritual life is finding some connection. So spiritual concerns, we have some reason to believe, may bring people to church, but spiritual communities are also what's going to sustain any sense of spiritual identity and practice. The work that I have done over the last several years has involved asking people to tell me stories about their everyday lives and listening for where and how those narratives about everyday life end up involving any kind of spiritual presence. And yes, reported primarily in the book Sacred Stories, Spiritual Tribes. And one of the things that I discovered in listening to people talk about what spirituality is, and we just listened in, we didn't say, okay, how do you define spirituality? We listened for how they used it, how they talked about it, how it intersected with their everyday lives. And one of the things we discovered is that spirituality really kind of comes in packages. It's not utterly random or individual. There are some patterns to how people think about what spirituality is and how they are thinking about how to pursue it. One of the things that just about everybody agrees is that if you want to call yourself spiritual, it better show in your life. That spirituality somehow has to include that notion of being a good moral person, of living by the golden rule. And I've included here just some quotes from those stories that we hear. The names you see are pseudonyms, but the way I've identified the person is actually their identity. This is a Catholic woman who's pretty involved in her Catholic church in Boston. But one of the other things that people often mean when they talk about spirituality is that they're cultivating some sense of their inner self, that spirituality is something that's inside myself, that I'm pursuing the true me, the me that's there under all of the trappings and the masks and so forth. And here, this is typical of the kind of thing you might hear from somebody we think of as a spiritual seeker. And we didn't find very many of them, but the guy we call Alex Polanyi is one. That he's really looking for that distinctive inner self. One of the other things that people often mean when they talk about spirituality is what they experience when they encounter something that is bigger, more awesome, out in nature especially, but sometimes also beauty encountered in art, in music, in sort of getting into the groove of something that is truly experienced as bigger than me. One of the other things people mean in terms of kind of bigger than me spirituality is a bigger than me connection. I'm part of something, I'm part of a community, a sense of connection to all humankind, a sense of being part of something that is bigger than me and that has a kind of something that I'm obligated to, that's beyond me. Now, one of the other things that people mean when they talk about this is that they're on a path, that they're pursuing a purpose in life, that their spirituality is this pursuit of a sense of meaning in their lives. All of these are what we might call extra-theistic. It's not a very felicitous term, but I didn't want to say non-theistic because while they don't require a connection with God, they don't preclude it either. And one of the things we discovered is that lots of people who are part of religious communities are very conversant with these ways of thinking about what spirituality is. So they talk about spirituality in ways that goes beyond just the kinds of ideas about God that they're hearing from their communities. But it would be a very big mistake to think that that's all that spirituality means. Because, in fact, the most common way that people talk about spirituality is in very theistic, religious terms. It's about God. That's how they make the connections for themselves. Their notion of what it means to be a spiritual person is to be connected to God. Sometimes that connection to God also entails a kind of sense that there are things in the world that God knows about and we don't, a kind of sense of mystery about the world. But this is also a kind of spirituality that for most people who engage spirituality this way includes a connection to a set of practices, to things that they do to pursue this spirituality. There is not just a kind of amorphous path that they're on, but rather a set of things that they have learned to do to try to get connected to their spirituality. Now, for most people, across religious and non-religious traditions, prayer and meditation of some sort is the most common thing they talk about if they're talking about a practice that connects them to the spiritual. That's really incredibly universal. Many of us in the Christian traditions often talk about prayer and Bible reading as if we're kind of, twins. Those are the primary things that we look to for spiritual practices. But one of the things we discovered is that Bible reading or scripture reading and study is very common and expected in some traditions and not in others. So if we're looking at people in other religious traditions, we shouldn't necessarily think that their adherence to studying scripture is a measure of how spiritual they are. Because we also discovered that there were lots of other things that people reported to us as things they do, practices that they engage in to pursue their spiritual lives. Some of them are things that are pretty common in many religious communities, like having a spiritual counselor or advisor. Lots of people keep journals, but lots of other people practice yoga. And my very favorite, and you're going to hear more about it this afternoon, is getting tattoos as a spiritual practice. And we heard, it isn't just Nadia. We heard a lot of folks talk to us about tattoos that they have that express their connection in their skins, that very visceral kind of connection to something spiritual. So lots of different ways to think about what spirituality is and how people practice it. So the question is, where are these people? Are they in our congregations? What's the relationship between our congregations and what's going on there and the spirituality and the practices that we discovered? And even more fundamentally, I would say, what can we say about that spirituality that's going on out there and people's everyday lives beyond our congregations? Because after all, we both want to gather them into faithful communities, but we also want them to live that faith, right? So I want to introduce you briefly to 4 spiritual populations. And the first of these is what I will call the spiritually serious. These are people who are, in fact, in your religious communities. They're there, they're practicing, they're a part of the community, but they're also engaged in their own individual spiritual practices. This isn't something they just do on Sunday morning. But what's really interesting about these people, I think, is that they're not just there in the pews on Sunday morning. And the only relationships they have are not just to the strangers on those same pews. These are people who are deeply embedded in social relationships. They have friends in their congregation. The people in their household are also very likely to be in the congregation, and they participate in small groups, in study groups, in service activities, in places where they can have conversations, where they can talk about what it means to them to be faithful people. The second group is the people I would call the typical members. Spiritually serious, by the way, in our population was about a quarter of the people that we talk to. The typical members are about a third of the people we talk to, a little more. They're there mostly just for worship, and not nearly as regularly as the people we call the spiritually serious. And they are not nearly as personally engaged in spiritual practices. They're not disconnected, either from their own individual spiritual practice or from gathering together. They're just not kind of engaged at an intimate and serious kind of level. These are folks who are found across all religious traditions. Everybody's got these folks. The first kind, the spiritually serious kind, are actually more typical in Mormon and conservative Protestant communities. Why? Not necessarily because of the doctrine, but because active, engaged participation in the community is normative and expected in those traditions. Everybody expects you to be involved in the ways that I just described. What's important for you to hear is that when we ask liberal Protestants about their engagement, if they had the same kind of engagement with friends, family, study groups, etc., in their congregation, they were as engaged in individual spiritual practices, as likely to see spirituality running through their lives as any conservative Protestant or Mormon. Okay? It's not about doctrine. So, typical members. And then there are the marginal members. We might think of these as a little like those liminal nuns we talked about. These are people whose connection to religious communities has pretty significantly frayed. They may think of themselves as kind of spiritual, and they may have a few spiritual practices here and there, but they kind of have to think hard to come up with them. They really don't think about their everyday lives in spiritual terms for the most part. They are on the margins, as I said, for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it is, in fact, ideas. They really disagree with the beliefs that they have encountered in a religious tradition at some point in their lives. And there are at least a few folks for whom the kind of, I went off to college and I discovered evolution and I decided religion was bunk kind of folks. But that's not really the typical story here. The typical story is actually one of encountering a moment in their lives when church just didn't come through. One of the most poignant stories was from a young African American Catholic man whose partner had died of AIDS in the late 80s, early 90s, and whose church just completely shunned and did not support him at all. And yet he hung on to this notion that can't be Christianity. I know there is a Christianity that doesn't look like that. But he wasn't very active in participating in a religious community at this point, because there had been that kind of break. Sometimes it's just you move and you kind of forget to join again. It's those typical members, you know. They're at different life stages and they just don't manage to make the connection. We also do have a small population of people, we're kind of back to the beginning here, of people who really are truly disaffiliated, who have very little interest in any kind of spirituality, do not think of that as part of their lives, it really never has been, and they don't ever attend services, although it's kind of funny to hear them talk about raising their kids because their kids still come home and say, "Mommy, what's a Catholic? Mommy, why can't we go to communion?" So they still have to they live in a world where these things exist, and they have to explain to their children. So different populations of people, engaged in different ways, connected to us in different ways, looking for different things, and many of them, in fact, looking for a kind of spiritual connection that for whatever reason they don't think they can find in our communities. What have we learned about those connections then? One of the most important things that I learned in looking at the stories people told me was that attendance matters, showing up matters. People who actually participate with other people who share some kind of spiritual view of the world, that matters. As I said at the beginning, we don't do very well on our own. We need a spiritual tribe. When that happens, when people are engaged with each other, then there is, in fact, more active individual religious practice, and it shows up in people's everyday lives much more dramatically. So we also can learn some things, I think, from the patterns by which people actually engage with our communities. Those typical members, the kind of threshold, remember what brings people back, the disaffiliated, why do they join? Well, they like the preaching or the music, right? The typical members, that's what they like most. They like the preaching and the music. So you probably better think about that as a kind of bottom line. You need to have some good preaching and some music that draws a particular community together into an experience that only music can do, as a kind of threshold, if you will, the door through which people come, the first place, the most sort of foundational place that helps to form a community of faith. But what holds that community of faith together, the bricks and mortar, are the opportunities for friendship, for fellowship, for learning, for service, for conversation, for talk, where we aren't afraid to say God, where we invoke the Spirit into our presence together, where we talk about the way our lives and our decisions are being shaped by those realities that are awesome and beyond us, those experiences that are sometimes mysterious, those experiences that call us to something beyond ourselves. So we're kind of back at the beginning here. We're back at the reality that spiritual lives require spiritual communities. But our task is not just to have those communities for the sake of turning in a really good report to the bishop. Our task is not just to build those communities because our larger society needs them, and don't forget that, please. Our task is not just to make people religious. Our task is to face the reality of those loose connections that we have to jobs and geography and households, to face that reality and nevertheless call people into communities, into a spiritual community where worship first introduces them to connections to God, where fellowship in a community introduces them to the vital connections to each other, and where opportunities for service are had so that they can understand the importance of their connections to the larger mission in the world. We need connections, as hard as it is to form them. We need spiritual communities. We need our tribes. Thanks.